Having gone over the regular paradigmatic forms for the aorist passive and future passive indicative forms, let's go over the forms for special verbs. For contract verbs, it looks just like luo, so you don't expect to see any difference in the forms for the aorist and future passive forms, except that, like all contract verbs, you should expect compensatory lengthening for the aorist and future tenses. So remember, just by way of review, the contract verbs undergo vowel contraction. That means you should expect the big 5, little 2 rules to be operating for the present and the imperfect tenses. So it's the present and the imperfect tenses for the contract verbs that are the most difficult. But in every other tense, the future, the aorist, and later when we learn the perfect, these tenses, the only change that you see in the stem is what we call compensatory lengthening. And that's very easy, because if you remember, if the lexical form for a verb like agapao, and the short vowel that it ends in is an alpha, it compensatory lengthens to an eta. And if it's poieo and the short vowel is an epsilon, the epsilon compensatory lengthens to an eta. And then if it's plerao and the short vowel that it ends with is an omicron, the omicron compensatory lengthens to omega. So you follow the same rules as if you were using luo, but for the passive forms, but instead add that compensatory lengthening to the stem. So if I want to do the aorist passive indicative for agapao, first give me my augment, which is an eta, because agapao begins with a short vowel in front. And then here's my verbal root. And then instead of an alpha here, I'm not going to use the alpha, it compensatory lengthens to an eta. And then I add the tense formative they, and then the first person singular suffix ending is the new. Remember that we learned that it's new, sigma, nothing, men, te, san for the aorist passive forms. And so I'm not going to write all these forms down. I'm just going to use the first person singular form for example, and I'm assuming that once you've seen the first person singular form, you can do all the rest. So ega thing is actually our form for the first aorist passive indicative, I was loved. So ega thing is I was loved. If I want to say I will be loved, take my verbal root, and I don't need an augment here, so it's not augmented. I got aga, and again, instead of using the stem vowel alpha, that becomes a long compensatory lengthening, aga pay, and then I add the they tense formative, the sigma tense formative, the connecting vowel omicron, and my. So agapethe samathai. Agapethe samathai is I will be loved. So I'm just going to again only put the first person singular forms. What about poieo? Well, for the aorist form, if I want to say I was made, I was done, have my augment, add the verbal root, and chain compensatory lengthen the epsilon, so it's an eta, and then add my thane, and epoiethane is I was made, I was done. If I want to say I will be done, I will be made, I would not have an augment. I would add my verbal root, and then I would have a compensatory lengthening. The epsilon, short epsilon that we would expect, becomes an eta, and then I would add my tense formatives, and then connecting vowel plus suffix. So poiethesomai is I will be made, I will be done. And then if I have plerao right here, the first aorist, I was completed, I was filled, the aorist form, add my augment. Here's my stem plus, and it's an omicron compensatory lengthening. The omicron turns into omega, so the omega is how the omicron compensatory lengthens. And then I add thane. So eploirothane. So eploirothane is I was completed. If I want to say I will be completed, no augment, the verbal root, compensatory lengthening, my tense formatives, the short the connecting vowel, and my, and plerothesomai is I will be completed. What happens when we have a stop verb? That means the stem will either end in a labial, a velar, or a dental letter. The aspirates are H-sounding letters. So if they have an H-sounding letter, then it's an aspirate. And what happens is, for example, if we take blepo, and then we add, for example, the aorist passive forms, that would be thane, and then of course we would have to add an augment to it to make it past time. So here's my verbal root, here's my augment, and I'm going to add thane, thes, they, thamen, they, te, thesan to the end. What happens when the stop actually connected to something that has an H sound to it? Well, the H, therefore, the H sound changes the stop, and in fact it gives that H or H sound to the stop, and so all the labials will become phi, all the velars will become he. So let me clear the board, and then let's give an example. So if I want to say aorist passive, I was seen, I would take my augment, I would add blep, but I'm going to aspirate this, and that's going to instead become a phi. And then I would add thane, and the form would be a blef thane. And that's a lot easier to say than a blep thane. A blef thane is simply easier. It's a softening of the pronunciation. So a blef thane would be I was seen. And if I want to write the future passive form for blepo, no augment. Instead of the P, I'm going to aspirate it, so it's a phi, blef, and then I'm going to add the tense formatives plus the connecting vowel and the primary active suffix, or primary middle suffixes, and then this would be blephthesomai, I will be seen. So a blephthane, I was seen, a blephthesomai, I will be seen. So what about the velars? The velars, again, you'll expect anything that ends with these stop letters to aspirate to a he when you form the aorist passive or the future passive, and it's because you're always adding that passive voice tense formative they to it, which aspirates these stops. So for ago, I lead, let me augment it. So here's my augment, and then let me aspirate that gamma. So the gamma is not going to, it's going to become a he. Then let me add the tense formative they and then the suffix endings, and echthane is I was led. If I want to say I will be led, I don't augment, I use the verbal root, but again, instead of this gamma here, this is going to aspirate to a he. So let me clear this up. I aspirated the stop letter, and then I add the tense formatives, then the connecting vowel, and then the primary middle passive suffix, and echthesomai is I will be led. And if I want to say I was baptized, the dentals turn into a sigma, so this is not an aspirate, it's something different, but that's the rule. The dentals want to turn into a sigma. So I have my augment, add my verbal root, and then instead of, and remember the verbal root for baptizo is baptid, instead of that delta, this is going to turn to a sigma, and then I add the thane, the tense formative plus suffix endings, and A baptisthane is I was baptized. If I want to say I will be baptized, no augment. Aspirate the dental, or in this case, turn it into a sigma, because that's what dentals do. Then add the transformatives, add the connecting vowel and suffix, and baptisthesami is I will be baptized. So with verbs with stops, the labials aspirate into a phi, the velars aspirate into a key, and the dentals use the sigma when you add the transformative they for either the aorist forms or the future forms. Here, in this slide, you have some practice. So why don't you do this? Let's just review together the verbal roots. For didasco, the verbal root is didog. Caruso, the verbal root is carug. Sozo, the verbal root is sewed without the iota subscript. So this iota subscript is not there in the verbal root. For doxazo, the verbal root is what? Doxad. And for grapho, the verbal root is graph. And given these verbal roots, why don't you fill in this chart? And for the aorist passives and the future passive forms for the first person singular, and I'm going to pause. Okay, I hope you had a chance to fill out the chart. Are you ready for for the answers? Ready? 1, 2, 3. There you go. So I filled out the chart, and just as a friendly reminder, remember grapho is different from the rest. Grapho will be different from the rest. Grapho is one of those rare words that uses the second aorist and future forms, passive indicative. And so you see a graphane, not a graphthane, and a graphesami, not a graphthesami, because this is a second aorist form. And this is something you memorize, part of your vocabulary, but the rest will follow the stop rules.